Hey guys, so today we're going to learn how to solve a quadratic using the quadratic formula. The cool thing about the quadratic formula is that it will always work no matter what quadratic equation you are given, along with graphing. So remember, you can also solve an equation, a quadratic equation, by graphing it and finding the points at which it crosses the x-axis. So that's the cool thing about graphing and the quadratic formula, what we're about to learn. They will always work. We've learned factoring last week, and you can't always factor every single quadratic equation, so that's why we like graphing and the quadratic formula. Okay, so no matter which way we do it, it's very important that our quadratic equation is set equal to 0. So no matter which way we are doing it, we want to make sure that it's set equal to 0. Okay, so whenever we're using the quadratic formula, it's very important to identify your a value, that's the coefficient to your x squared, your b value, the coefficient to your x, and your c value, your constant, the number that's by itself. Okay, once you know your a, your b, and your c value, you're going to plug it into the quadratic formula, which is this guy right here. Okay, and the way I think about it, this is negative b. So the way I think about it is whatever my b value is I think of it as the opposite of my b value. So if my b value was a positive 5, I'd put a negative 5. If my b value was a negative 5, I would put a positive 5. So I always treat this guy as the opposite of my b value. Okay, then you put a plus minus. I'll talk more about that later. The square root of, you take your b value, you square it, subtract 4 times your a value times your c value. All of that over 2 times your a value. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump into some examples so you can see what that looks like. So the first thing we want to do is make sure that our equation is set equal to 0, which it is. Perfect. All right, now that it's set equal to 0, I can identify my a, my b, and my c value. Okay, so remember, a value is the coefficient to your x squared. So you look at x squared, look at the number in front of it. Well, that is 1x squared. To find b, you go look for your x and look for the number in front. Well, I see a negative 10. And your c value is the constant, the number by itself, which is a positive 21. So now all I have to do is use these numbers to plug into this formula right here. So it's a one big fraction, so I'm going to start with the big fraction bar. On the top, negative b, remember, think of that as the opposite of our b value. So here's my b value. The opposite of a negative 10 is a positive 10. Okay, then we put a plus minus, and the square root of, okay, now it tells me to take my b value and square it. So my b value is a negative 10. What I always like to do is put everything in parentheses. So my b value is a negative 10. So in parentheses, I'm going to put negative 10 and square it. Minus 4 times the a value. My a value is a 1. Times the c value, which is a 21. And on the bottom of it, I want 2 times the a value. So 2 times 1. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to simplify this guy. So up front, I have 10 plus or minus the square root of, okay, and notice inside the square root, I have a lot going on. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to type this inside part only into my calculator to figure out what does the inside of the square root simplify to. Let's see if my calculator is up and running. It's not, I'll show you on the next one. But, okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to type this into my calculator so I can see what the inside of that radical simplifies to. So in my calculator, I'm typing in parentheses negative 10, close the parentheses, square it, minus 4, parenthesis 1, close it, parenthesis 21, close it. So all of this on the inside simplifies to a 16. So all I did was I typed this part right here into my calculator to simplify it. All right, on the bottom, 2 times 1 is a 2. Okay, let's go ahead and continue to simplify. So I have 10 plus or minus. Okay, now what I want to do is figure out, does this square root of 16 simplify into a nice pretty number for me, okay? So the square root of 16, a lot of you probably know that off the top of your head, but if not, you can always type it into your calculator. So the square root of 16 is 4, and on the bottom we still have my 2. So 10 plus or minus, I know the square root of 16 is 4, all over 2. Okay, so now how do I work this plus or minus? So this is how we're going to come up with our two solutions. The first time I'm going to take 10, add 4, and then divide by 2. The next time I'm going to take 10, subtract 4, then divide by 2. So first time, 10 plus 4 divided by 2. Then I'm going to do 10 minus 4 divided by 2. Okay, well 10 plus 4 is 14. 14 divided by 2 is 7. Ten minus 4 is 6. 6 divided by 2 is 3. Okay, so I know my two solutions, which means this parabola would cross the x-axis here at 3 and at 7. So the way we can write our answer is like this. My solutions in my brackets are 3 and a 7. Which means our parabola crosses the x-axis at 3 and then again at 7. It has two solutions. All right, so let's try another one. Okay, on this one, I have x squared minus 7x is equal to 18. Well, remember I said it's very important to make sure that your equation is set equal to 0, which this one is not. So before I can figure out a, b, and c, let's make it equal 0. All right, so to make it equal 0, I need to take away 18. What I do on one side, I have to do on the other. So these would cancel, so then I would be equal to 0. On this side, notice I have x squared, I have x, and then I have constant, a regular number. So none of these are like terms, so there's no numbers here I can either add or subtract together. So on the left side of the equation, I'll have x squared minus 7x minus 18. Okay. So now that my equation is set equal to 0, I can identify my a, b, and c values. So remember, you find a by looking at the coefficient of your x squared. Well, I have 1x squared. So a is 1. My b value is the coefficient to x, so I look in front of x, I see a negative 7. And c is the constant, the number by itself, which is a negative 18. So now that I know my a, b, and c, I'm going to use these values to plug into this equation. So it's one big fraction, so I like to start with the fraction bar. Remember, treat this as the opposite of your b value. So look at my b value. It's a negative 7, so I'm going to start with a positive 7. Plus or minus the square root of, I'm going to take my b value and square it. So remember, it's important to use parentheses in here. So my b value, which is a negative 7, using parentheses, squared, minus 4 times your a value times your c value, all over 2 times the a value. Okay, now I'm going to simplify. So I have 7 plus or minus the square root. And what I want to do is I want to simplify all of this stuff inside the radical. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to type this part into my calculator to see what it simplifies to. So I'm typing in parenthesis, -7, close parenthesis squared, minus 4 times 1 times -18. And that gives me 121. Okay, on the denominator I have 2 times 1, which is a 2. Okay, I'm going to simplify a little bit more. I have 7 plus or minus, and I want to see if this will give me a pretty number when I take the square root of 121. So if you don't know it off the top of your head, type it in. The square root of 121 is 11, which is pretty. So all I did was simplified this piece now to get the 11. All right, so now I'm going to do 7 plus 11 divided by 2 to get one of my solutions, and then I would do 7 minus 11 divided by 2 to get the other. So first, 7 plus 11 over 2, and then 7 minus 11 over 2. Okay, well 7 plus 11 is 18. 18 divided by 2 is 9. Over here, 7 minus 11 is -4. -4 divided by 2 is a -2. So that tells me I have two solutions. It's going to cross the x-axis at 9 and also at -2. So I have two solutions, so I'm going to write it in my brackets. And it's always proper to put it in numerical order. So my parabola crosses the x-axis at -2 and then again at 9. All right, so we need to identify our A, B, and C values, but remember before we do that, always see if it's set equal to 0, which this one is not. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of this -3x and this -7. Well, to get rid of a -3x, we need to add 3x's to both sides. And to get rid of a -7, we need to add 7. What I do on one side, I do on the other. So these cancel, which is now equal to 0, which is what we wanted. Okay, but on the left side, we have x squareds, we have x's, and we have constants, regular numbers. None of those are like terms, so I can't add or subtract any of these numbers together, so I'm going to rewrite it as 6x squared plus 3x plus 7. All right, now that it's equal to 0, I can identify my A, B, and C values. A is the coefficient of x squared, so I look in front of x squared, 6. B is the coefficient of x, so I look in front of x, it's a positive 3. And C is the constant, the number by itself, which is a positive 7. So now I use these values to plug into my formula. Okay, so it's one big fraction. And it starts with -b, which think of it as the opposite of b. Well, my b is a positive 3, so I'm going to start with a -3. Plus or minus the square root of, so remember, inside of your radical, let's use parentheses. I need to take my b value and square it, so I need to take this 3 in parentheses and square it. Subtract 4 times the a value times the c value. And on the denominator, we have 2 times the a value, so 2 times 6. All right, from here, what I'm going to do is simplify. So I have -3 plus or minus a radical. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to simplify only the inside of the radical. So I'm going to type this guy right here into the calculator. So I'm typing in parentheses 3, close parentheses squared, subtract 4 times 6 times 7. Okay, inside of the radical, I get negative 159. Okay, simplify the denominator. 2 times 6 is 12. Okay, from here we would try to see if I can simplify the square root of negative 159 and get a pretty number. So I'm going to actually type that in and show you what happens. So earlier we typed in the square root of 16. Oops. The square root of 16. And notice it gave us a pretty number, right? Okay, this time on this problem we have the square root of negative 159. Notice I get an error. That's because you can't take the square root of a negative number. Those are what you call imaginary numbers, which we won't learn about in Algebra 1 at all. So if that ever happens, if you ever get a negative inside the radical, you can go ahead and stop. If this ever happens, you can stop because you can't do it. So what this means, if you have a negative inside your radical, your answer is going to be no solution, which means your parabola will never intersect the x-axis. So if you ever get a negative inside the radical, you can go ahead and stop and say your answer is no solution. It means your parabola will never touch the x-axis. Okay, we have a word problem. We're still going to do it the same way we've been doing. We're going to solve this quadratic using the quadratic formula. It tells me we have an area of 36 centimeters squared. So this rectangle has an area of 36. Well, we know that to find area of a rectangle, we take the length and we multiply by the width. So I know I'm going to have these two and I'm going to multiply them together. All right, so I have x times 2x plus 1 equals, so when I multiply my length and my width together, it equals the area. What it told me that the area is 36. All right, so I have my quadratic equation set up now. But right now it's equal to 36, and I need to take care of distribution. So first I'm going to distribute. Then I'm going to make sure it's set equal to 0 so I can find my a, b, and c value to use this quadratic formula. All right, so first, let's distribute. X times 2x is 2x squared. X times 1 is a positive 1x. And right now it's equal to 36. Well, we don't like that. We want it equal to 0, so what I have to do is take away 36 from both sides. These cancel, making it equal 0, which is what I wanted. None of these are like terms, so I'm going to write it as 2x squared plus 1x minus 36. And now that it's set equal to 0, I can identify my a, my b, and my c value. So the coefficient of my x squared is 2. That's my a value. The coefficient of x is a positive 1. That's my b value. And my constant, my number by itself, is a negative 36. That's my c value. Okay, so now I'm going to use these numbers to plug into the quadratic formula. So I start with one big fraction bar and negative b, which we think of it as the opposite of our b value. So I look at my b value. It's a positive 1, which means I want to start with a negative 1. Plus or minus the square root of, okay, remember it's important to use parentheses in this part. So I'm going to take my b value and square it. So I'm going to take 1 in parentheses and square it. Subtract 4 times the a value times the c value. On the bottom, I want 2 times my a value, so that's going to be 2 times 2. All right, so now I'm going to simplify. So I have -1 plus or minus my radical. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to simplify the inside of the radical. So I'm going to type all of this into my calculator. So in my calculator, I'm typing in parenthesis 1 close parenthesis squared, subtract 4 times 2 times -36, and that's going to give me 289. To simplify the denominator, 2 times 2 is 4. Okay, now what I need to do is see, does this radical simplify into a nice pretty number? So I have -1 plus or minus, so if you don't know, type it in. Type in the square root of 289. And I know the square root of 289 gives me 17, which is pretty, divided by 4. Okay, now I'm going to use this to find my two solutions. The first time, I'm going to take -1, add 17, divide by 4. The second time, I'm going to have -1, subtract 17, divide by 4. Okay, -1 plus 17 is 16. 16 divided by 4 is 4. All right, over here on this side, I have -1 minus 17. That's going to give me a -18 divided by 4. Which that gives me -9 over 2. So I have my two solutions, 4 and -9 over 2. So let's think about what this problem is asking us. It says use the quadratic formula to find the width of the rectangle. So we're trying to find the width of the rectangle. This is x. Well, I have two answers for x. I have x is 4, and I have x is -9 over 2. Well, only one of those answers is actually going to work here. So now that you watched the video, I want you to kind of think on this a little bit. Which answer should we go with? Should we say that x is equal to 4? Or should we say that x is equal to -9 over 2? So I want you all to think in that. And then if you go open the Google document after you watch the video, there's a space for you to write what you think. Do you think we should use the answer of 4, or do you think we should use the -9 over 2 as our answer for the width? And give me a little explanation why. All right, bye guys.